This is, of course, dependent on another key element, the recognition of the subjectivity of the research within the research process, and the need to be reflexive and to engage with, reflexive in approach, appreciating the positionality of yourself as researcher. The use of audio-visual methods is considered, we think, to complement feminist methodologies as a practice of, and instantiating a feminist practice of looking, acts to engage with and challenge conventional relationships of power associated with the gaze, as Kindon argued in 2003. Although the adoption of this methodological approach can mitigate some of the consequences of imbalances of power, it's also the responsibility of the feminist researcher to address these dynamics of power not only in the research process, but as they play out in our wider society, as this forms the basis of these approaches. Banks argues that, for example, in film elicitation, quote, by creating images of persons and their actions, the social researcher is intervening in the lives of those she works with, forging representations in which they have a variable degree of interest and over which they may have little control, end quote. For McDowell, the term embodiment then encompasses the fluidity and flexibility of the socially constructed nature of the body moving through time, which for women can be the root of their subordination. The spatiality of women's marginalization is conceptualized around often a public-private dichotomy where patriarchy alienates women to the domestic private space of the home. Patterns of mobilities, as feminist researchers within mobility studies are charting, have changed the dynamics of this dialectical relationship, creating quasi-private spaces of automobility. We therefore contend that in drawing attention to the politics of intersectionality as well, feminist methodologies may move alongside mobile methodologies to usefully reveal gendered unequal mobilities through situated and embodied experience explorations.
So in that way we're drawing from feminist studies of gender, but also from studies that relate to generation. And it's perhaps in this study of generation that there's this confluence of time and space. And we're talking about time within research methodologies in terms of kind of looking back and situating our research subjects in a kind of long history, and thinking through mobility histories as well as the kind of spaces and the being there that we tend to concentrate on within mobile methodologies. And so generation is by definition temporal, and is often understood through longitudinal approaches that adopt a linear concept of time, and in doing so create the false demographic categories. Mobile methodologies have been used in research that makes visible the mobile injustices, we believe, that are experienced by particular generations, and that applies, particularly in terms of our own work, to children and older people. So streets, for example, are built to facilitate the movement of car traffic through urban space, lights at pedestrian crossings that are too short, and driving habits that ignore the presence of pedestrian crossings or crosswalks. So hence the speed, or this kind of this idea of temporality of mobility, is at odds with the speed or temporality of these generations. So while kind of mobilities are accelerating for certain generations, we feel that particularly for children and older people, they're kind of living in a different kind of temporal frame. So we draw here from social studies of childhood methodologies that acknowledge children as actors in social processes, they're as valid sources of knowledge, and that children's agency can provide valuable input to research methodology. So drawing from James Jenkinson Prout, for example. Research projects such as Nicola Ross's project Extraordinary Lives, which looked at the everyday lives of children in care, found that mobile methods offered, I quote, offered much value in generating rich accounts of the everyday lives of young people in care, and supported their participatory approach, connecting well with the young people's own cultures of communication. So we know that mobile methods are good methods, and I've used them in research with children, are good methods to use when working with children. Recent research in the field of mobilities using mobile methodologies has contested discourses of dependence and vulnerability, for example, in relation to children. And of course, these kind of insights, or these methodological insights, that have been discussed in relation to children can also be applied to older people, and we have to do so critically and think through what that means. For example, researchers such as Christian Fisker have opened up mobility patterns and habits of older adults, drawing attention to gerontomobilities as an emergent area in mobility studies, particularly germane with demographic transformations of populations worldwide. In my own recent work on generational mobilities, I draw from Mannheim's conceptualization of generation as more than the product of biology, but associated with a location in a continuum where members of a group become associated through shared experiences within a particular socio-political and historical context. So it's a politicized term. It's a way of talking about age that we think in a kind of political way. So although existing studies on the embodied experiences of children and older people provide rich data on their mobility experiences, we feel what is needed is more attention to the broader context in which these embodied mobilities are situated. There is often little discussion of the situatedness of experience beyond the local. So an example is a study that I often quote, Bostock's article, which is in which she looks at 3 pathways to gendered ill health and reduced well-being. And those pathways are managing worn-out children, being fatigued from walking, reduced opportunities with the lack of car in an automobilised society. So when I looked back at this, I found very little reference to the kind of situatedness of the research. Bostock states that the methods were based on principles of anti-discriminatory practice and consequently, compared with national trends, includes a disproportionate number of mothers and minority ethnic groups. But I think this is a very important point to make within her research, but she does that without very much further contextual work, and so the point behind that becomes lost.
I'm thinking we should probably skip to slide 10, which is the end.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
2 minutes left.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to skip a little bit, over, of course we're way too long.
We've done the main points there.
Yeah,
the important
okay.
bits.
Do you want to just maybe go through the slide?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're talking the very last slide.
It's the one with the feet. No, second to last. That
Okay.
one. So one of the things that also concerns us in terms of thinking about this is that how we can also integrate studies that come from both media and communication studies into issues of transport and urban design, and the way that now we inhabit spaces that we're often negotiating between different forms of communicational environments that are assemblages that are incredibly complex. And we heard some of this yesterday as well with the paper that Judith was doing and discussing in terms of the gun camera as a kind of mobile assemblage through space for thinking through the racialization of power. What we're interested in is how mediated street spaces are also increasingly mediated, and thinking about spatial design as a kind of technology for interaction, but also thinking about the ways that spaces are set up, not just as spaces of transition, as we're going to look at with the Shamrock Place study, but also New Road, and thinking through, as people like Sadie Plant have done, the way that social interaction is occurring using different mobile technologies in these spaces, but also comparing in a way how different generations are engaging in different communicational practices because of the design of the spaces themselves. So we're thinking out is carrying out this kind of comparative study between these three locations, examining digital practices, being attentive to both gender and generations as they produce different forms of mobilities and communications within these city spaces. The pilot project we're conducting, and it's just underway, Lesley starting next week, is conceived of as a comparative mobilities project spanning 3 continents, with the investigation of these kind of urban street spaces in Brighton, the UK, Santiago de Chile, and Montreal. The research is premised on an understanding of the negotiation of the visible and invisible differences in mobile spaces of the cities that determine the lived experiences of the space-time for people of all ages. The mobile part of cities, in streets and pavements, for example, sidewalks, can be particularly contested and marginalizing spaces where street design can be enabling or disabling for those who move at different velocities, including those who are older. Increasingly, these spaces are negotiated digitally. They're at the interface of the materialities of the built environment, communication technologies, and the bodies who use these devices. And for example, as we've noted in the Shamrock Place example, what often happens is that while people go to the market to shop, they leave another generation of persons behind to be with the children and guard them. And also, if they don't have a mobile device, we're interested in the kinds of waiting times that get set up and the kind of movements and patterns that we see both during days of the week, but also during a given day. So again, thinking through the kind of notion of being attentive to temporalities also means being attentive in the Canadian case and in the Brighton case to issues of weather. So thinking through time and temporality in these multiple ways in relationship to mobilities. So do you want to?
I think we can stop there. So, I mean, I think that a good place to stop is just thinking about why comparative. And I know we're a minute over, but just thinking about what that provides. Does it provide us with richer data? Thinking about how design travels. That was an important aspect of the comparative study. Thinking about the different contexts we're looking for. So working across Latin America, North America, and the UK and Europe. And that idea of where the design travels was a kind of important aspect of what we were doing. So our study, which, as you can perhaps tell, is in its infancy, is about thinking through those processes of comparing different locations in time and space.
I wonder if you could say a bit about the bench, because I think it's an integral artifact to also the point that's actually in some ways holding this. One more minute.
Maybe another time. I'm not getting good vibes.
Okay, not getting good vibes from
of carrying on any longer.
Thank you.